Another literary giant of the age and another contributor to the popularity and formation of the genre of the short story is Nathaniel Hawthorne, and I am pretty sure that all of you have at least heard of him through his novel, The Scarlet Letter. But in addition to being a novelist, he wrote seven major novels, but in addition to being a novelist, some of his most popular fiction was that of his short stories. So, Nathaniel Hawthorne was born in Salem, Massachusetts, and Puritanism was on the wane in that region. And this is significant. I mentioned Puritanism because Hawthorne's relatives were Puritans in the 1600s, and that influences him and his writing significantly. His father died when he was 4, and his mother was really consumed by mourning as a result of his father's death, and Hawthorne spent much of his childhood alone. The more Hawthorne learned about his ancestors, his Puritan forefathers, the more withdrawn he became. His great grandfather, and I think his great uncle, William and John Hawthorne, or Haythorne. He adds the W to his name later on to kind of separate himself from his ancestors. They were involved in the persecution of suspected witches in the 1600s and 1700s. And Hawthorne was deeply ashamed of his family's involvement in the Salem witch trials. And for most of his life, I mean, you would probably call him a hermit today because he spent most of his life alone. But this isolation was caused by this great guilt of his ancestry, of his heritage, and he was never really able to separate himself from what he considered to be that inherited guilt that was passed on to him from his ancestors. And that contributes heavily to his view of the world and the style of his writing, which um, almost always takes place in New England, and most of which are moral allegories with Puritan inspiration. I can think of maybe one or two stories of his that don't deal with this kind of Puritan guilt or what have you. One of which is Rappaccini's Daughter, which is a lovely short story, but it's really long, and I didn't think that you guys would want to read almost a novella. But anyways, and his writing style also kind of goes in and ties back to that romanticism movement that Washington Irving is a part of. And the romanticism ultimately seeks to illustrate a point rather than portray what is actually real. And that goes hand in hand with that impressionism that I was talking about earlier. But like Washington Irving and even Edgar Allan Poe, who we'll talk about next week, and other writers of the age, Hawthorne was romantic in terms of his writing. And we know that because all of his stories have this kind of setting in the distant or in the past, which gives it the readers that distant feel. There are supernatural forces involved in some way, and like I said, that idea of seeking to illustrate a point rather than convey a sense of realism. But Hawthorne is tied more consistently to what we call dark romanticism. It's not as he has a very different view of the world than someone like Irving. When we think of dark romanticism, there's kind of that hint to the Gothic. But dark romanticism is an exploration of the dark side of human nature. It focuses on things like murder, sin, corruption, darkness of nature, animals, weather, however you want to look at it. It's exploring the things that aren't as positive or is lighthearted as someone like Washington Irving. But typically, we have main characters who are deeply troubled, or they deeply trouble another character. So, young Goodman Brown is one such character. Hawthorne thought that the darker side of the human heart was being overlooked. And in his view, humankind might have good intentions, but were ultimately unable to escape their natural state. Men are evil, sinful, and tormented by guilt, brought down by pride, and intolerant to the extreme. And this belief is based on the concept of original sin from Adam and Eve that passes to all humankind. We are at our cores fallen beings who are inherently evil because of our lineage back to the Garden of Eden. And I hope that you can kind of see this kind of parallel between how Hawthorne thought of his ancestors and how he views humankind as a whole. Because Hawthorne held this view and believed that the acceptance of our evil natures was better than the denial of it. And this particularly is important because he felt that since we are all sinners, we should try to understand each other and show compassion rather than judgment. And he looks in his writings, Hawthorne does, at the complexities of who we want to be and who we are naturally at our core. And he does that in the story, Young Goodman Brown. So I'm going to stop here and I'm going to pick up with a little bit of background information for us to kind of talk about before you go into your reading. So stay with me. I'm almost done. I know I've given you a lot.